In the 1960s, deep in the middle of a country at war, a group of North Vietnamese security officials boarded a plane, not to Moscow, not to Beijing, but to East Berlin. They weren't there for diplomacy. They were there to learn how to build a surveillance state. And the teachers? The most feared secret police force in the communist world, the Stasi. To understand Vietnam today, you have to ask a question most people never think to ask. Why is the Vietnamese government so extraordinarily good at suppressing dissent? Vietnam isn't just authoritarian in a casual sense. Citizens' daily lives are closely monitored by the state. The country's best journalists and writers are either censored or in prison. Protests are shut down with quiet, clinical efficiency. And at the top of it all sits the Ministry of Public Security, the MPS, answerable not to the courts, not to the people, but to one institution, the Vietnamese Communist Party. In recent years, researchers studying Vietnamese politics noticed something striking. Former security officials have come to dominate not just law enforcement, but key positions across the entire government. It's a phenomenon sometimes called securocracy. It's a system built to endure, built to control, and it didn't emerge by accident. To understand how it got this way, we need to go back. Back to the Cold War, back to a divided Vietnam, and back to an alliance that has been hiding in plain sight for decades. When Ho Chi Minh's forces seized power in August 1945, one of the first things the new revolutionary government did was create a security force. Not an army, not a court system, a security force, a handful of armed militias, loyal to the party, tasked with one thing, making sure the revolution stayed revolutionary. In 1946, these militias were unified under a single decree. Their mandate was sweeping: maintain order, resist foreign enemies, and crush domestic political rivals. By 1953, Ho Chi Minh had signed another decree upgrading this force into the Ministry of Public Security. Its official tasks: fighting against spies and reactionaries, protecting the borders, and countering foreign intelligence services. But the party's grip was already being tested. A movement called Non Van, Gai Pham, led by intellectuals pushing for political reform and academic freedom, was gaining momentum. Rural Vietnam was in open unrest after a disastrous land reform campaign. The leadership in Hanoi looked at these crises and drew one clear conclusion. If the party was going to survive, it needed a far more powerful and sophisticated police apparatus. And so the decrees kept coming. In 1961, the government issued Resolution 48, authorizing the re-education of anyone deemed a counter-revolutionary. The following year, a new decree expanded the definition of enemies of the state to include South Vietnamese agents, Catholics, and anyone who had worked for the French colonial administration. The result? Approximately 4,000 people in Hanoi and other northern cities were sent to remote re-education camps. Between 1961 and 1965, over 11,000 people were classified as dangerous to security and social order and disappeared into the camp system. The Ministry of Public Security wasn't just fighting enemies. It was deciding who the enemies were. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most people, even historians of the Vietnam War, tend to overlook. To build the kind of security state it envisioned, North Vietnam needed help. And in the mid-1960s, the most useful partner it could find wasn't the Soviet Union. North Vietnam's relationship with Moscow had actually cooled significantly by 1963 and 1964, largely over disagreements about how aggressively to pursue reunification. Instead, Hanoi turned to East Germany, and specifically to the East German Ministry of State Security, the Stasi. If you don't know the Stasi, here's the short version. It was arguably the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus in human history. At its peak, the Stasi employed one informant for roughly every 63 citizens in East Germany. It intercepted mail, bugged apartments, ran psychological harassment campaigns against dissidents, and maintained files on millions of its own people. And it was very willing to help its communist brothers in Vietnam. The first contact between North Vietnam's MPS and the Stasi dates to 1957, a modest request for tape recorders and cameras. The first ministerial visit came in 1960, but the real partnership didn't kick into high gear until 1965, as the Vietnam War escalated and U.S. troops began arriving in the South. In December 1965, a North Vietnamese delegation arrived in East Berlin with a detailed wish list for Erich Mielke, the head of the Stasi. They wanted technical training, espionage devices, intelligence operational expertise, and Mielke said yes. The East Germans called these shipments solidarity shipments, a diplomatic name for spy gear, surveillance equipment, forged documents, and everything else that goes into building a modern security state. Training courses began in late 1966. North Vietnamese security officials learned how to gather intelligence, intercept mail, use invisible ink, and analyze and fabricate documents. The full toolkit of a Cold War secret police force. Here's a specific story that illustrates just how significant this collaboration became. In 1967, the U.S. government provided South Vietnam with a new, highly sophisticated identity card called the Green Dragon. The purpose was straightforward: help the Saigon government identify and track down North Vietnamese agents operating secretly in the South. The card used advanced technical features that made it, supposedly, impossible to fake. By 1972, North Vietnam had successfully duplicated it. The fake Green Dragon YDs were produced at a facility in Hanoi, whose staff had been trained by the Stasi. These counterfeit cards were then issued to high-level North Vietnamese operatives working in the South, allowing them to move freely through South Vietnamese checkpoints, avoid detection, and continue their work. The East Germans also supplied these agents with fabricated seals, optical equipment, lock-picking tools, and time-delay fuses. Think about what this means. A forgery and surveillance infrastructure, built with East German training and technology, directly enabled North Vietnamese intelligence operations in the heart of enemy territory. Operations that shaped the course of the entire war. And at the same time, that same infrastructure was being turned inward, on North Vietnam's own population. At the same time, the MPS was using Stasi techniques to fight the war in the South. It was using them to control the North. Hanoi asked the Stasi to help set up a mass surveillance system, including an internal security department, specifically to monitor its own people. This came as the North Vietnamese leadership was conducting a brutal anti-revisionist campaign, with hundreds of party cadres and intellectuals being arrested. The surveillance model the MPS adopted was straight from the Stasi playbook: informants. Ordinary people recruited to spy on their neighbors, their colleagues, their family members. In a 1967 speech, MPS Minister Tran Quoc Hoan praised the informant network, describing these individuals as essential to uncovering and combating all types of counter-revolutionary targets, especially spies conducting secret operations. This wasn't wartime improvisation. It was deliberate architecture, a system designed not just for the duration of the conflict, but for what came after. When the war ended in 1975 and Vietnam was unified the following year, East Germany didn't pack up and go home. It provided substantial additional equipment and training to help Hanoi assert control over the newly incorporated South, a region full of people who had just spent years on the other side. The formal relationship was cemented in 1980 with an official treaty of cooperation between the two regimes, covering intelligence exchange and counterintelligence efforts against Western countries. The partnership lasted until the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, and the Stasi itself was disbanded in 1990. So where does this leave us? The historian Martin Grossheim, whose research for the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project forms the backbone of this story, argues that Stasi assistance was instrumental to the modernization of North Vietnamese security forces, and by extension, to the security apparatus that governs Vietnam today. This is not ancient history. The Ministry of Public Security today is one of the most powerful institutions in the country. It has a substantial annual budget. Its former officials now occupy key positions across the entire government. And its methods, surveillance, informant networks, the preemptive targeting of dissidents before they can organize, trace a direct line back to what was built with East German help in the 1960s. In 2022, the party used the same apparatus to crack down on registered NGO leaders, civil society figures, who in most countries would have legal protection. They didn't in Vietnam. The journalists are in prison, the activists are monitored, the protests are stopped before they begin. And now you know how that system was built and who helped build it. There's a tendency when we talk about authoritarian states to treat their repression as somehow natural, as though countries just end up this way, as though it's inevitable. But repression is engineered. It requires expertise, technology, training, and institutional knowledge. It is built deliberately, carefully over decades. Vietnam's police state was built with blueprints from East Berlin, with tape recorders and forged IDs and invisible ink and informant networks, with the full cooperation of the most feared surveillance apparatus the 20th century ever produced. Understanding that history matters, not just for researchers and historians, but for every journalist, human rights defender, and activist who has to navigate this system today. Because you can't challenge a machine you don't understand.